With nearly 40 titles in the series, it's surprising to see how timid the franchise tends to be when it comes to remakes. Hell, the dedicated team behind our favorite Pink Glutton likes to experiment with all sorts of interesting gameplay ideas, instead of relying on the past, which is why we rarely see modern reimaginings of well-known or forgotten classics. However, once in a while we are lucky to get that chance, and Return to Dreamland Deluxe proved its right to exist by establishing a bunch of quality modes on top of the more than solid base game. The same goes for Nightmare in Dreamland as well as Superstar Ultra, resulting in a trilogy of amazing Kirby remakes. Now, after the storm is settled, let's compare those three remakes to each other and find out which of them served their job best in bringing light to their original. Starting in chronological order, Nightmare in Dreamland released in 2022 for the Game Boy Advance and improves on Kirby's Adventure with its charming and tight pixel art style. Right from the start, you could argue it's the most basic of these three, as Nightmare in Dreamland was solely developed in order to simply bring out a quick Kirby game for the little handheld, hence offering the least number of new features. Nonetheless, it doesn't mean you should overlook this trip into the old NES days, as there are still some quality of life improvements worth noticing. Obviously, the graphics lived through a huge upgrade and resemble the GBA era of Kirby, possibly one of the most pleasant looking styles in the series. Especially the pixel work done on mini-bosses is full of details, and the backgrounds are just as atmospheric as in the original. Of course, some areas might simply look different instead of actually better, with the airship level having a superior sense of loftiness and adventure if you ask me, but overall it's a step up in almost every inch. Almost, because some moments are poorly translated and seem to make no sense regarding how the origin tried to depict certain elements. The same goes for secret passages, which are often now oddly black holes, appearing like the creators forgot to put a texture in there. And you cannot even claim there's no way to circumvent this due to the ship level using an approach similar to the original, with putting a black spot in there, screaming, "Please enter me." The same goes for some animations, like climbing up an incline being removed or Meta Knight not throwing items in your way anymore. It may not be perfect, but at least great, as copy abilities now feature individual costumes, some of them even altering the way Kirby is colored, a feature they should bring back in modern titles. It's a shame, however, that skills do not make use of expanded movesets like in Superstar, something that feels very restricted when being used to perform dynamic actions. In the original, only being able to use one move made sense due to its natural higher difficulty. Many mini and regular bosses either deal damage by touching Kirby or throw him away, and there's always the risk of utilizing a copy ability and dealing with the danger of being near the enemy but causing consistent damage, or having a safe distance but being restricted to only counter with star bits. The same risk versus reward is not apparent in the remake, as Nightmare in Dreamland is generally easier and there is never a reason to not use a copy ability. On top of that, some expected quality of life improvements are simply not implemented, like fighting against bosses again, combining fairly similar copy abilities, which were already combined in past titles, not letting you leave a level you haven't beat, or some recovery animations giving you no chance to gain back your skill. None of these are a big deal on their own, but as a whole show a certain lack of ambition when it comes to truly reimagining the original. There are new enjoyable minigames indeed, but the true star of this remake and main selling point is Meta Nightmare. With limited health similar to the extra mode and no options to save, you are forced to beat the whole campaign with Meta Knight in one go. Today, it's not so noteworthy to have the chance to play as the lonely swordsman, as Star Allies gives you a plethora of iconic characters to interact with, but back in the day it was an extremely appealing feature. How you unlock this feature is not so appealing after all. In order to play Meta Nightmare, you have to complete both the regular and extra mode 100%, where instead the extra adventure should have been the reward to beating the normal adventure regularly and Meta Nightmare for 100%. Besides, not having the option to save is not so detrimental in regard to the overall short playtime, but simply not necessary. Another way to attention to this mode would be lives, the presumably outdated feature according to a lot of players. Because you have only 3 health points as Meta Knight, deaths become much more common, and by going game over, you would have have to play the whole mode from the beginning. Meta Knight is fairly strong by himself, and thanks to cut sequences, like the minigame at the end of a level, it would have been a nice breeze and challenge to play through. There are actually more smaller nitpicks I could show, like a lacking multiplayer for example, but I do not want to portray Nightmare Dreamland any more negative than I already did. It might not be the most optimal remake and was clearly done only to release something, without really trying to make this the ultimate version of Kirby's Adventure, but it's still an enjoyable basic ride from the beginning to the end. Now we come to the real behemoth of a remake and Kirby entry, Superstar Ultra. Released in 2008 for the DS, the Ultra version is a remake of Kirby Superstar for the Super Nintendo, a compilation of all sorts of different modes and short self-contained adventures. A personal anecdote of myself, this was the first time I was truly looking forward to a Kirby game, and back in the day I had no idea it was a remake, so there was no comparison to pull from. Even without this knowledge, Superstar Ultra is to this date a prime example of how to handle a remake, and not without a reason the #1 spot of all Kirby games for some players. But how did it achieve such a reputation? Naturally, the original's adventures are still there with all their glory. Spring Breeze, the Great Cave Offensive, Gourmet Race, the complete entourage. The focus of the remake are all the extra additions, which basically double the amount of content in comparison to the original. Granted, most of them are fairly similar and there's not a single new inclusion that is truly new. Still, they altered them more than enough, like Revenge of the King, which is a combination of Spring Breeze and Revenge of Meta Knight. You're basically going through a harder version of Spring Breeze, seasoned with the charming band of Revenge of the Meta Knight. It strikes a perfect balance of feeling known while adding a fresh breeze, and just like with every other mode, it doesn't come across as stretching the game lazily. The same goes for Helper to Hero, a dedicated arena for every single partner. Under normal circumstances it's not possible to play as one of the helpers in single player, but here you get the chance to go wild and test your skills against all these bosses. Of course, gameplay wise there's no real difference between the copy abilities and the fire helper, but just like with Meta Nightmare in Nightmare in Dreamland, it's the simple appeal to take control of these obscure characters. Speaking of Meta Knight, once again there's a full dedicated mode, but this time much more elegantly implemented. The controls feel way more fluent, there are new powerful moves, you can create trusty companions just like Kirby, and a secret boss at the end. It might not be truly new, but appears to be the kind of mode the developers wanted to include in Nightmare in Dreamland from the beginning. Apart from all these new additions, there's self-evidently the upgraded graphics, presenting one of the, if not the best sprite work in all of Kirby. This is more of a personal thing, but I was never a fan of the controls in the original, and Superstar Ultra feels just right in that regard. Also, being remade on a handheld, the complete concept of having self-contained adventures fits the flexible nature of a portable console a lot more. The only downside I can see is not being able to play on a TV and the multiplayer. It's a lot more comfortable to play with friends on a home console, since Superstar Ultra requires the other person to have a DS on his own, but other than that, Superstar Ultra is an almost perfect remake in any way, and to this day an excellent instance of a remake improving on every aspect without losing the charm of the original. This leads us directly to the most recent endeavor, the remake of Kirby's Return to Dreamland, released on the Wii in 2011. Being the important stepping stone for the franchise to this day, Return to Dreamland might not have aged at all in terms of gameplay, graphics or any other aspect, but is simply worth the remake for the fact how much it defined the series. When the first trailer showed up, no one was really expecting something beyond a graphical overhaul, plus smaller extra features, like new minigames or the mecha ability. After all, we just received 2 other titles within the same year, so it was reasonable to hold back expectations. On top of that, there were not many options to expand on the original, since it was a more than complete adventure on its own. As time went on and more information appeared on the surface, this healthy restraint turned out to be completely wrong, as the deluxe version didn't withhold at all. New as well as old minigames, a whole amusement park with smaller collectibles, masks, and a brand new campaign for Margolor started as mere wish thinking but turned out to be true. Especially Margolor's epilogue might be the best extra mode in any Kirby game, as it only reuses very few assets from the normal adventure and mixes things up with special features like the leveling system. It also allows for interesting challenge runs and clearly gives you the impression of becoming stronger throughout the short campaign. The final to this mode is so ambitious, it might even be more spectacular than most regular mainline entries, and all the the lore implications further feed the vague narrative behind the franchise. In a sense, Margolor's epilogue is almost a game on its own and surely lifts this remake to something worth experiencing, even if you have played the original. Not to speak of smaller but essential improvements like the increasing running speed, new animations, pause screen, descriptions, even harder extra mode and many more. The question that remains is how this remake differentiates itself from Superstar Ultra and the different approach it tries to go. Instead of adding a bunch of fairly similar modes you have already seen in the original, like in Superstar Ultra's case, Return to Dreamland Deluxe aims for one big quality mode, being completely apart from the main adventure. Whatever approach you like more and what makes more sense for a remake is up to debate, but most people will agree that Return to Dreamland Deluxe basically outshines its blueprint, just like Superstar Ultra, and shows no signs of being a cash grab in a year full of Kirby games. The only thing left is ranking those remakes. Going through every point I presented, it might be pretty safe to say Nightmare in Dreamland remains on the last place, with its lovely improvements but overall lacking features. You could still play Kirby's Adventure for the NES without missing too much, even without nostalgia, and Nightmare in Dreamland could have enhanced the original with a little more thought put into this entry. Now it becomes interesting. Both Superstar Ultra and Return to Dreamland Deluxe excel on slightly different terms, and it really depends on your preferences. Do you want to enjoy a couple of short but unalike campaigns, often reusing stuff you have already seen, or one big new mode focusing on a fantastic presentation but almost identical base game? Both titles deserve to be praised, but Superstar Ultra still holds the candle for being one of the most perfect remakes of all time. There's nothing the DS could have done more, and they truly perfected the original's concept with logical and interesting inclusions. Whatever the case may be, it's commendable that every remake delivered to some extent, and even with a packed release year like Kirby's 30th anniversary, it seems like the quality and care for Kirby will never vanquish.